calling this the fake news of Renaissance cartography. We tie in innovatively to the present day, but I notice other people have used the term the title of their paper, so much for my innovation. I'm just going to take you briefly and orally through what I'm doing because this is part of a larger project. And so essentially, this comes out. I went back to school to get a PhD in spite of being a tenured professor, and my dissertation was Print, Powder, Compass, Technological Interanimation in Early Modern Literature. And so as you see here, essentially what I did is I looked at how these three technologies shaped literature in the 16th century, the long 16th century, including what literature could become and what it could no longer be because of these three technologies. I presented last year on gunpowder technology in literature, which is part of the project, and the year before that on print. So this is the final episode of that work, which is on the magnetic compass and cartography and its relationship to literature. I didn't pick these indiscriminately. They're actually part of Francis Bacon's famous work on what are the most important technologies that transformed the time period that he was sort of born into. And he said it was these three. He wasn't the first to say them, but he's the first to have said it in English. And so that's sort of what's used canonically. This is a frontispiece to his book that Francis Bacon's The Advancement of Learning, and you can see he has the two pillars of Hercules, and contrary to the belief of non plus ultra, go no further, he is plus ultra, let's go further. And so that's kind of a sort of metaphor I try to anchor my presentation and project on. So essentially the chapters on the compass look at these two kind of avenues. One is to explore the anxieties and exuberances that were the consequence of the Renaissance need to redrop the map of the world. And so I don't just focus on, the formal cartographical legacy. I look at, ballads and all sorts of forms of literature so that we get a really holistic picture of the time period. And then to assess some desperate moves that came with having to recast cultural history and topography based on navigators' recent discoveries. So this is not the staid world of map making that you may think. Sorry, I'm turning like all red. So the overarching goal of this sub-project is to underscore how highly fluid actually this time period was in terms of modern map making, early modern map making, more like a bricolage, which often gets obscured today because we tend to science-ify the culture of maps. And so I want to vivify this project, the extent to which cartographic culture impacted poetry and plays, tragically, comically, etc. And so I'm going to just focus on two things today because this comes out of a 200-page section on the magnetic compass. In order to sort of convince you of this, I want to tell you about the collective and ingrained legacy of Prester John. I'm just curious, have any of you heard of Prester John? Oh, awesome. Okay. Well, maybe not so awesome. And also the anxiety and exhilaration of terra incognita. I very much emphasize that technology breeds an incredible exhilaration and an anxiety simultaneously, and that you have to study all forms of literature to really get across that kind of fabric. So I'm going to just read so I can get through in the appropriate time here. So let me start with Prester John. He had initially appeared in John Mandeville's 14th century Travels, a text of considerable influence during the Renaissance. It was available by 1500 in virtually every European language. Mandeville maintained that in spite of Prester John's name, a byproduct of his conversion to Christianity, he was emperor of India, and with a palace so wealthy, so noble, so full of delights, that it included more than 30,000 people eating and 7 rotating kings to serve him. Perhaps that is why, by the end of the 15th century, Mandeville's own name had become fraught with a variety of meanings. Knight-errant, archetypal traveler, mythical figure, but also grandfather of lies spun like truth. More fascinating for our purposes is how the seat of Prester John's empire later drifted to Africa when the deepening Islamic and particularly Turkish presence in Asia Minor made land travel to India all but impossible. True, some maintained that Ethiopia was part of India, given that 4 centuries of sources have referred to it as such. The only problem was now there were 2 Prester Johns, one Indian and one Ethiopian. Even more, how exactly are we to explain the obstinate 400-year survival of this figure into the 16th century?
The Renaissance explorer Amerigo Vespucci, for one, attested to sailing along a coast, quote, which in my opinion is the beginning of Asia and the province of Arabia Felix, which is the land of Prester John. Some 75 years later, the Flemish cartographer Abraham Ortelius would print as part of his 1573 atlas a map entitled The Kingdom of Prester John, because for him, Prester John and his empire were an unquestionable reality. Says Ortelius, this Prester John, out of doubt in our age, is one of the greatest monarchs of the world. With a map illustrating the monarch's vast empire stretching laterally from the Nile to the Indian Ocean and down to the southern tropic. As for Prester John, he is now cast as a great king and commander of all Ethiopia and sundry other kingdoms and countries. And not only are his subjects now Christian, Prester John now, quote, affirmeth himself to be descended from the line of King David. But Prester John could not only be cartographically set adrift in the 16th century, he could also be personally and physically met. Edward Webb, in his Travails, recounts not only having gone from Damascus, quote, into the land of Prester John, but that he, as master gunner for the Turks, had actually served against this Prester John, who with his power, quote, flew of ye Turks the number of 60. Eventually, Webb settles into an embellished description of Prester John's court, clearly pulled, whether directly or by virtue of literary legacy, from Mandeville, with some novel marvels and monstrosities mixed in, including a bountiful table from which Prester John had served 50 kings, with a meat dish eaten at that table reduced now to, quote, a dead man's skull clean picked. Clearly, not only could geography be mobile, so too was the centuries-old library of knowledge, which in its earlier incarnations had long hinged for reasons of memory on place. In a sense, then, what we are dealing with is not merely a bricolage born of map makers being forced to rely on secondary and sometimes questionable sources. Also reflected here is an epistemological mouvance, which is to say a variation, modification, and even wholesale rewriting or abandonment of discrete collective knowledges tied to place. Knowledges that would eventually require evacuation from cosmography in order for geographical science to emerge. One cartographical region where those older knowledges continued to survive was in territories and bodies of water that were still relatively unknown. For while the routes and seacoasts plied by merchants may have been growing ever more accurate, the parallel appearance of terra, as well as aqua incognita, not only kept the classical world alive, but participated, sometimes willfully, sometimes not, in the production of what I can only call an unreliable narrative. Thanks to the discovery of new worlds, the entire world map had gone from being a self-enclosed space to one full of gaps and blank spaces, and even entire land masses whose borders could slip unobtrusively into the empty grid of the unknown, as does North America here in this right Molyneux chart. What was sea? What was land? What was empty? Was it empty or inhabited? In this way, the world was becoming more full and more empty, with new stretches of coast or hitherto unknown or even unsuspected islands now being annually announced and then mapped. So swift could these announcements appear, in fact, that in his world map of 1513, Pierre Ray saw fit to append an inscription to the blank parts of South America, writing, "By now these parts have been conquered and explored in full." But there was also a tendency for mapmakers to fill in these gaps, a propensity, according to some contemporary scholars, that stemmed from a cosmographic, quote, horror of the void. Some during the Renaissance had certainly thought the same. The learned Thomas Fuller, for instance, took Mercator to task for incorporating contrived etiologies for winds and ocean streams, accusing him of, quote, preferring to fill his map with a fiction than otherwise to leave it altogether empty. Ortelius would disguise the Renaissance dearth of knowledge regarding inland Asia by way of a massively thick branched river system and imaginary towns. Should we commend him for at least trying to localize legends, such as his inclusion of a throne potentate alongside a notification that this was, quote, the great emperor of the Tartars and the prince of Cathay, commonly called the Cham, who rules far and wide here. On the other hand, if a tendency toward the whole and fully integrated was characteristic of the period, philosophically speaking, that meant the map eventually had to be filled in, whether by means of empiricism or speculative deduction. This might be accomplished by fabulous creatures pulled from Pliny, as in Guillaume de Testu's mythically peopling Asia and Africa in his 1556 Cosmographie Universelle with headless Lemmy, one-eyed Aramasps, and web-footed Cyapods. Typically, the most repulsive of these legendary monstrosities were cast to the farthest confines of the inhabited world, as if in a religiously or potentially Jungian continuation of the lineage of Gog and Magog. While such creatures may have served primarily as ornament, they also paid homage to classicism's sacrosanct ingredient of variety, with the ocean serving in that capacity particularly well. Is it any wonder then that men who actually piloted and plied the seas might sometimes respond to these maps with fierce aggravation? Often they did so in print, driving home the novel rift that was emerging between humanists who held on to classical traditions and these rising mechanics of the sea. And what when those mariners say discovered that the Atlantic island of Friesland and Antilia were not where they were supposed to be? Instead of cartographers eliminating these entirely imaginary islands from their maps, they were simply, not unlike Prester John, moved further west. Sometimes when a controversy arose regarding whether a place or a passage that had been adopted in an earlier map really existed, that part of the map might conveniently disappear behind cartouches, concealing, while also inadvertently advertising, the terra incognita now lying beneath. Sometimes this concealment came by way of a patron's coat of arms or an illustration of an antique or contemporary astronomical instrument via thumbnail sketches or fanciful vignettes, or even the map maker's own identity. As for what more precisely this particular series of cartouches before you was concealing, it was the entirely fictitious continent that emerged parallel with the more realistic shadings in of the non-fictitious Americas. In short, by the first quarter of the 16th century, a protracted and relatively extensive region known as Terra Australis, or the southern continent, began cartographically to appear. And sometimes it could be really protracted. While this was a continent no one had ever actually seen, let alone reached, its inclusion was felt to be necessary. This was not only because Ptolemy had authorized it, or Marco Polo allegedly visited there, but because it was also true to the ancient ideals of balance and symmetry and ergo perfection. In other words, Terra Australis, the ultimate terra incognita, served as a massive and imaginatively necessary counterforce to the recently discovered and increasingly burgeoning northern regions of the world. This geographical balancing act was in fact one of the perceived roles of any map of the entire world, as distinct from sea charts with their reality-driven but only partial truths. Not implausible was for the southern continent to appear with its own detailed topography, including mountain ranges and connected inland bodies of water, as well as places allegedly visited by Marco Polo. Indeed, Francis Drake's famous voyage of circumnavigation was partly motivated by a desire to locate Terra Australis, though it would only prove the continent's location on recent maps was erroneous. Upon being driven far south of the Horn, Drake and his men found themselves in open sea, and so the southern continent's absence from that 1599 Wright Molyneux map, with the region abashedly covered up with a series of cartouches. Nevertheless, the belief in a gargantuan southern continent persisted, with Pope Clement VIII, even authorizing a mission in 1601 to Terra Australis in order to save its inhabitants' souls. Perhaps Clement VIII had been persuaded by the natives, who could be found illustratively ensconced in the unknown interior of Terra Australis, though they had been pragmatically imported there from the equally unknown interior of Brazil. It need hardly be said that maps of this period were driven as much by what might be as they were by what was. While unknown interiors might have been cartographically satisfying in their colonial implication as one of pending accumulation, they also encouraged a mounting belief that parts of the world might always remain beyond human reach. That cartography was in fact a false pledge to fixity. In fact, herein lies one of the most profound ironies of Terra Australis. For while that continent potentially signaled what was out of reach in the world, it also had become an integral part of the world. Perhaps as a concluding musing, the licensed speculation that went into fashioning that region speaks to our more universal human impulse to imagine the unimaginable, something that can be most fruitfully accomplished in regions not yet explored. And in the contemporary context, of course, outer space comes to mind. Moreover, if the critical difference between America and Terra Australis was that the former was defined by a gradual process of discovery and the latter by an elaboration of fantasy, perhaps there was some archetypal rationale for both becoming elaborated at the same time. In other words, that human propensity for counterbalance applies no less to north-south than it did or does to fact fantasy or even comedy tragedy. Each requires its reversal in order meaningfully to exist. Thank you. It's hot.
Thank you, Sheila.
Sure.
So our next presenter is Michael Kulo.
Can I sit here?
You can sit anywhere. Talking about the ineffable Samson, McLuhan, and Plato's supervening forms.
I could jump. Okay, and as I wrote to Paul at one point, I mean, you'll see it at the end. I mean, the paper probably should be called that Plato, McLuhan, Bergson, and Baxendall go into a bar, realize the limitations of language, and say nothing to each other. Okay, let me start with Pope Francis's quote from Laudato Si that frames this year's MBA conference. You've heard this quote several times. You'll hear it several times more, I'm sure. Furthermore, when media in the digital world become omnipresent, their influence can stop people from learning how to live wisely, to think deeply, and to love generously. In this context, the sages of the past run the risk of going unheard amid the noise and distractions of an information overload. End quote. His focus on the encompassing media environment and not specific content cues us to how language distracts even when it hopes to inform. Medium and language work most effectively, seamlessly, and transparently when they reinforce the capacities of one another in a symbiotic manner. Say when a filmmaker conceptualizes a narrative first and foremost in cinematic terms, differing from those of the novel from which his movie stems. As Michael Chabon notes in his novel, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, without its brilliant exploitation of the capacities of filmmaker, would be just another flat story about a disillusioned wealthy magnate. And we can only think about bad film versions of books like Doom or something like that. Marshall McLuhan's argument that the medium is the social message describes how, quote, the medium shapes and controls the scale and form of human association and action. Indeed, it is only too typical that the content of any medium blinds us to the character of that medium, unquote. As W. Torrance Gordon notes in his introductory to McLuhan's Understanding Media, quote, when McLuhan speaks of a medium transforming information, he is not referring to facts or knowledge, but to the response of our physical senses to the medium, end of quote. In this model, content and medium communicate simultaneously, but the medium does so through a much more profound visceral level, one which affects audiences phenomenologically in their transparent immersion in that medium, much as any absorbed reader or film goer experiences. I want to argue today that while we often treat language as a medium in itself, mostly when we consider the rhetorical forms with specific capacities, such as the poetic with its testing of the capacities of evocative nuances, or persuasive oration with its clear resonance and unspoken social values, that language fundamentally differs from media forms in its essential focus on signified content. McLuhan's notion of the medium, I'll argue, parallels Plato's notion of supervening forms, in which language functions with specific dimensional capacities, but in doing so obscures how its medium gives it consistency across an infinite variation. In this argument, language acts as an intermediary between the medium and content, particularly when it probes the dimensions of its medium through a meta-language of indexicality. But ultimately, it remains a barrier between the two, masking over how it operates through its firm focus on specifics in the now. In this exploration, I'll turn to Bergson to underscore the colonizing power of language that tightens our need to look to the affect of media that remains ineffable in language. Let me start first by turning to the hermetic nature of language domains in themselves. In Giotto and the Orators, Michael Baxendall talks about ekphrasis, the verbal description of visual images that early humanists, Renovatio of Latin in the 13th and 14th century Italy drew from the classical past. Defined by the 2nd century rhetorician Hermogenes of Tarsus as, and this is ekphrasis he's describing, quote, an account with detail. It is visible, so to speak, and brings before the eyes that which are to be shown. The special virtues of ekphrasis are clarity and visibility. The style must contrive to bring about The style must contrive to bring about seeing through hearing, end of quote. In an era marked by the rise of vernacular voice in poetry and literature, most evidently, obviously, Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, classical models offered a far richer model of scholarly inquiry, pointing to the unique capacities of different verbal languages in themselves, the vernacular versus Latin. Okay. This issue of linguistic capacity lies at the heart of this paper, of the moment of semiosis. But when we engage the world through multiple languages daily, of particular interest here through the verbal and the visual, ekphrasis contrives to blur the boundaries between vision and verbal description. But as Baxendale notes later in another book, Patterns of Intention, verbal language can only talk around images. Yes, sensitizing our minds to look in specific manners or on context, but only through an analogy that he draws from astronomy, that of looking off, that counterintuitive process of focusing just off of a faint star when we want to bring it into better view. So sort of judging your eyes, shifting them aside to bring greater context in and understand what we're seeing better. Art historians constantly use verbal ekphrasis as a means of guiding students to see more carefully, sensitively, and knowledgeably, yet in doing so mask over the mutually exclusive domains of the verbal and the visual. Just as Heinrich Wolflin noted in 1920 that paintings more reference their collected painted selves in their history than they do their subjects, a point repeated 60 years later by Roland Barthes about photography's self-referentiality and distance from its subjects. Writing about the visual ultimately forms its own illusions of connecting with direct vision, but only in that contrived manner, instead distancing viewers from the immediacy of vision through an impenetrable fabric of words. Baxendale notes it most succinctly, we do not explain pictures, we explain remarks about pictures, only insofar as we consider them under some verbal description or specification, end quote. The ultimate incompatibility between verbal and visual languages revolves around their operations within specific media, most clearly marked by how differently they work as types of signs. Charles Saunders Peirce notes three typologies of signs, the mimetic, the indexical, and the symbolic. Each medium draws on the three differently. The verbal uses the mimetic only in automatic poiesis, the indexical largely in the realm of pronouns, and the symbolic overwhelmingly, as de Saussure noted, symbolic languages revolves around cultural conventions with no a priori attachment between the sign and the signifier. The visual, in contrast, has a strong pull to the mimetic, so much so that viewers really see mimetic elements in purely abstract signs, as Leonardo da Vinci reminds us when he muses on imagining faces in the imprint of a sponge tossed against the wall. Its symbolic capacity is traditionally termed iconography and iconology by Erwin Panofsky in my field, of course, of the abstract cultural conventions such as Neo-Platonic Christians using light as divine presence as a form of knowledge. But the least signified of Peirce's typology, the index, also gives us a significant role, as Svetlana Alpers reminds us in her treatment of 17th century Netherlandish paintings as a form of map making. In images, the mimetic devices the mimetic deceives the viewer by upholding an illusion of seeming transparency of its medium in representation, most familiarly to us in the acceptance of photography as a normative vision, while the symbolic pronounces itself as a culturally defined abstraction, as in the Protestant favoring of unadorned minimalistic crosses as a signifier of Christian beliefs. The index, however, sits between these other two typologies, linking its sign to its signifier by directly pointing to it. It neither self-effaces, as the mimetic does, nor stands in as a physical sign of purely abstract function, as the symbolic does, but instead marks both its presence as a sign, yet the reality of its signifier impressed upon the sign. The index works like a footprint or a scar, a physical presence pointing to an object, action, or idea, through the latter's having left its impression on the former as a remnant of its being, much as a bear once did, scratching open my beehives and engraving its claws across the aluminum surface of the beehive. Okay, that's an index. We're most familiar with the index and its roles of photography. Well, the image not only represents a scene mimetically and symbolizes whatever social codes it will, it also points back to the experiential moment, documenting what is in the frame, but also to the knowledgeable viewer, what lies beyond the frame and immediate moment of the shutter stroke. As an index, the image serves as a point, as the point of event, as experienced and rekindled in memory, remaining present, but constantly diverting the viewer's attention to the experience beyond. Not only do we use photographs indexically in our own personal lives, 5 minutes, say when we have documented a vacation or whatever, but we also do so when we contextualize images in time and space, as in, say, images on news events that we can place in a Washington, D.C. of different times of years, eras, specific geographic loci, even if we only know the place through the vast public archive of other relevant images. As such, the indexable image overtly suggests the dimensionality of its referent, but never pretends to fully describe it. Whereas the mimetic mode, through its apparently seamless representation, typically attempts an illusion of full description, and the abstract in its calling attention to itself as principally as a symbol manifests itself as a reference to it, but references itself in its presence, rendering the subject as a consciously present sign. In pointing to its subject, never denying its own secondary role and never claiming authority, the index describes openly the link and ultimate gap not only between sign and object, but between language and medium. McLuhan marks a disassociation between medium and content, and in his example of the light bulb, which in having no context appears equivalent in what it affords from neurosurgery to nighttime baseball. Its affordances do have parameters, the commonality of application creating an index of its capacity, such as the archive, beginning to map out its realm of affect. McLuhan turns to Ernst Hans Joseph Gombrich's discussion of cubism as a departure from realism. I'm going to skip this because it's about how the painting actually manifests the abstraction, because I'm getting down in time here. Okay. But it is this notion of painting that really stands in, becomes something that is supposedly abstracting. Still, as noted above, the physical being of the collective images only indexically point to the capacities of the medium. We're all familiar with Plato's analogy of the cave, okay, and what he describes of how the physical world shows an a priori ideal. But in the Timaeus, he introduces a third element, the supervening form. Plato describes the supervening form as a receptacle, which we can only sense through the collective examples that we agree as comprising the one thing, action, or idea. He notes, quote, suppose you're molding gold into every shape there is, going on nonstop remolding one shape to the next. If someone were to point to one of them and ask, what is it? Your safest answer by far would be, it's gold. Okay? Never a triangle, any other shape, or anything else that came to be in the gold, though in these, because they change as you're making the statement, end of quote. The supervening form clarifies the ideal by remaining impervious to the differences among the objects within its class, filtering only for their common essence, but remaining absolutely ineffable to the true form. For Plato, the specificity of language would obscure the ground in which it operates, papering over its reference to the presence of the sign. In many ways, McLuhan's medium performs in a manner similar to Plato's forms, in that its affordances may vary widely, so much so that McLuhan reminds us that, quote, indeed, it is only typical for the content of any medium to blind us to the character of the medium, end of quote. In the case, and I'll skip Gombrich again. Okay. I'm going to skip Bergson too because we're down to the wire, guys. Okay. What I want to say is to distill the passage from Bergson's ideas down. Our capacities of thought in their conscious structuring by language become socially colonized, limited by constraints external to ourselves, thereby yoking us to social ideologies that damp down our ability to think freely as individuals. While we might struggle for freedom within our society, we can only do so within the frameworks of a language that we have developed in participation with that society, and hence the ideologies that its language tacitly encodes. In a manner similar to its capacity to obscure its medium, language is giving form to thought, in giving its form to thought, prevents us from addressing the mechanisms of thinking directly. Here as well, the indexical aspects of language provide pointers as a meta-language that identify the limitations of cultural contact by pointing to concepts that remain protean, if not fully ineffable, yet through our sentience as living beings, always palpable. In an age enamored with quantifying the world with digital data, quote, the medium is the social message and, quote, has particular pertinence. From McLuhan, Baxendale, Plato, and believe me, Bergson, all describe where language masks over its inabilities, leading us to miss the forest for the trees. As we constantly hear of our great fortune for living in the information age, we need to ask ourselves, in the process of datafication, how does this digital language obscure our native acuity, our ability to observe without guidance, quantification and semiosis? In other words, to see observantly, to hear beyond what we would normally listen for, to sense beyond what we already understand. Over scores of millennia, language certainly has served us well, as quite recently big data has with its abilities that touch our lives daily. But the wealth of language and data in itself blind us to their limitations, specifically to what Terence Gordon notes as the responses of the physical senses of the medium. Rather than following the cues of the indexical following the cues of the indexical, attentive is a meta-language and metadata that allows us to look off the specifics in hand, not so much to see them better, but rather to consider the limitations of them. The indexical sign, whether the verbal pronoun we, the physical marker, bear claws against the beehive aluminum skin, or accumulated digital archives of calls placed, emails received, and websites visited, points us to the media themselves, uncluttered by the compelling content of the moment. Only when we start looking off can we get a shimmering sense of the medium, those supervening forms that create the environment for thought. Ultimately, these realms remain inchoate, protean, ineffable, but the process of semiosis by which we attempt to imagine them only contrives, to use Hermogenes of Tarsus's term, to make them knowable to the rational mind, creating too readily the, quote, noise and distractions of information overload. End of quote, end of paper.
The next paper is Marshall Soul, from Vancouver Island University, Cuba's Revolutionary Landscape.
Well, I want to thank the two previous speakers for preparing the groundwork for my talk. It was perfect background and gave you tools for my presentation. My wife Donna is reminding me that I often go over time, so I've got a new strategy here. I'm going to entertain our granddaughter on Ladysmith Harbor. We sometimes skip stones. So in my talk, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be trying to skip stones and see how far they'll go. And they're going to touch down at certain places in a body material that I've been working on for a number of years. And I need to go here and see if it comes up. And if it does, we're good to go. This is a project that's what I call ethnographic documentary project. So it's got lots to do with semiotics and indexical photographs and pointing fingers, and you'll see a lot of those in here. So the project started in 2006. I'm still working on it. I got short funding for it called the Canada-Cuba Image Dialogue. I went to Cuba, took photographs all over Cuba. I drove across Canada with my wife Donna, and took photos of Canadian signs in the public sphere. I think it's a case study in media ecology and visual propaganda. And I think it touches on the question of spirituality and national consciousness here, because you'll see that I'm talking a lot about faith, faith in the future, faith in the land, faith in the revolution, and so forth. So this is a piece from Havana. The moral of the revolution is as high as the stars, quote from Fidel. So how do we understand what's going on in the country? And there's a constant push to extend our thinking to a higher sphere. I've heard lots of that kind of thinking here at the conference so far, and I know that you'll be able to relate to that idea. I also just want to, another touchstone here is, I consider this project of Cuba as a machine to think with. It allows a comparison to be made between the Cuban social experiment and the North American social experiment. There's lots of differences. Basically, Cuba, since the revolution in 1959, has operated under a state of siege. It's a huge social experiment that I think needs to be observed. This is a quote from McLuhan from The Mechanical Bride, where he looked at advertising and tried to read the codes and symbols of the advertising to determine what's really going on here. So ours is the first age in which many thousands of the best trained individual minds have made it a full-time business to get inside the collective mind. To get inside in order to manipulate, exploit, control as the object now. Why not assist the public to observe consciously the drama which is intended to operate on it unconsciously? That'd be my kind of manifesto. I love this idea from Benedict Anderson about nations being imagined. How do nations come into being? And it's a collective imagination of how we all identify with our country. Imagine political community, and nations dream of being free. It's a dream they have. This is the dream that the Cubans have. I know the Canadians have this dream as well. And we all, how do we collectivize that imagination and put it into action? I think that's really, it makes me weepy to think about it. So how do these signs work? Here's one. The sign says, Cuba, an example of peace and solidarity. It uses the strategy of interpolation and hailing. Hey, you, take a look at this. And then attribution of value. Hey, you, look at this. You should adopt this idea. You should adopt this watch. You should adopt this car. So that's one of the techniques that are used. The project also takes a look at, I think what's already been spoken of here already today about the layering of messages. So this is the image that I used in my book, Media Persuasion and Propaganda for Edinburgh University Press, because I really liked the idea of a person reading in front of a sign with the architecture behind. So I think this qualifies as a media ecology type of image. And you've got the colonial history of Spain as the context. You've got the wall there. You've got the revolutionary slogan, revolution in every neighborhood. And you've got the student reading. And part of the whole strategy of Cuban leadership over the years has been to use these billboards to teach reading. It's part of the literacy program, so they teach, and that's the original strategy of the Brigadistas, who brought the literacy in Cuba up so quickly in the early days of the revolution, was to teach the people how to read about their values and their beliefs and what they wanted in their country. So this is part of the dream of Cuba. This idea of Cuba Libre originates in the mid-19th century with the first wars of independence, and it's the thread that binds all the wars of independence and struggles for independence in Cuba to the present day. The dream of freedom. So a lot of things going on in Cuba right now. A lot of things aren't going on in Cuba, but a lot of things are happening. So the Trump presidency sort of dialed back the diplomatic cooperation with Cuba after Obama spent considerable effort trying to make some inroads there. There's a lot of tourist infrastructure from non-U.S. enterprises. You can't do business in Cuba if you're a U.S. enterprise. The revolutionaries are aging. Fidel passed away recently. Raul took over, his younger brother, And there's a new generation waiting to take leadership roles in Cuba. That's going to be changing things. And there's a continuing dialogue there now about what do we do about the internet? Do we give it to the people? Do we restrict it? Can everybody get on it? I've got a good friend there, runs a business. The only thing he can do on the internet is email, basically. He can't really look at image-heavy websites. So that cuts out a lot of information for him. And it's not an infrastructure problem. It's a restriction on what people can actually see there. There's generational differences. We've talked to many young Cubans who are going, oh my God, North America, everything's so cool there, and they're not maybe so tied into the revolutionary ethos as their parents or the older generation. There are some dissident writers there, despite what the media might have you believe, especially a person, Yoani Sanchez, made a real splash by getting her blog smuggled out of the country on a flash drive and put up on the internet. You can read about her picture of Cuba online. Just search for Generation Y, Yoani Sanchez. And the last time I was there, which was a year ago, I was really surprised at the way the street scene changed in Havana. There's a lot more street art. And I think that's a really encouraging sign. And the street art is really interesting. It's not openly critical of any political system, but it gives you a very strong feeling. And what I'm saying is part of reading the culture is being able to feel what the feeling of the messages can be, not just what they say. So I'm talking about the murales. My friend Ramiro calls them murales. Other people just call them billboards. I'm just talking about the Mistredo propaganda here. So that's another spiritual connection. It's the propaganda of the faith. The spirituality here, in my interpretation, is faith in nation and revolution. The murales provide education in literacy, in history, in morality, beliefs, conduct, community for Cubans and tourists. They encourage, as values, cooperation, conformity, and action, generally speaking. And they identify challenges to state power. A lot of the billboards are openly critical of policies directed at Cuban nation. Cuban media is dominated by the Granma organization. They publish the only news, mostly the main newspapers. There's other options. And they pretty much promote the party line. You can read all about it online if you want. And I want to talk about the power of images for a minute. This is a little bit more confrontational image than a lot of them I'll show you. But the Cubans, when I was there in 2006, 2007, 2009, George W. Bush was the President of the United States and was trying to make all kinds of changes in the United States. The Cubans didn't like Bush that much, so they equate Bush, add him to a terrorist, Luis Posada Carrilles, who was instrumental in blowing an airplane out of the sky in 1970s. They're equating him to fascism and Nazism. So there's a whole series of those images that will pick up on that theme. A lot of the images are painted on walls. They're like fresco type paintings. And imagining Cuban independence, as I mentioned, that started in 1868. There was some independence wars in the 19th century, and it was continued by Fidel Castro and the July 26 movement. There's a lot of slogans, a lot of symbols, a lot of codes, and this is an example of the thousands of billboards across Cuba that reference history and the people, the heroes, the martyrs, what their ideas were, where they were. Every province has its, or state has its heroes. And Antonio Maceo is a giant. And a phrase that comes up over and over again is patria muerte, nation or death. So the idea of sacrifice and giving for your country is firmly threaded through the dialogue here. This is, remember, Playa Huron, which is the Bay of Pigs invasion, so that's a big touch point for any referencing there. I've got a few images here of monumental architecture that provide the same propagandistic function. This is in Santiago de Cuba, and that's called the Machetes, and this is in Havana. This is the anti-imperialist plaza. It was installed right adjacent to, at that time, the U.S. Embassy, and the U.S. Embassy from the 5th floor was broadcasting messaging, kind of scrolling ticker tape that 10 feet high, and so then these flags were put in front of it to block that. So it's an ongoing kind of competition. Daniel Ortega's really influential essay called Timocracy, Panopticism, and the Landscape of a Normalized Community is really instrumental in my thinking here. Timocracy is a state based on the values of leadership, patriotism, responsibility, sacrifice, cooperation, and not on social status, prestige, or wealth. So the leaders of the country are timocratic in the sense that they have to demonstrate the values of the country and carry them out. So I've got a motor along here. I'm just skipping stones. Great example of panopticism at the Presidio Modelo. That's on the Isle of Youth. I got a couple of images there. There's committees for the defense of the revolution. They convey a sense of vigilance in the culture, and their motto is everywhere. Che Guevara, obviously a timocratic figure, so he's everywhere. He's the promoter of the idea of being in the vanguard, the idea of the revolutionary vanguard, providing leadership for the people. And he's paired up here with Julio Mella, founder of the Communist Party in Cuba, and Camilo Cienfuegos, and they're the kind of patron saints of the Young Communist League. So it shows the influence of the leadership in defining the values. Okay, I got 1 minute left, and I'm going to just quickly run through Jose Marti. These are just examples. I won't explain them, but you can take a really quick look at what they look like. There's a wide range of styles. So you can see I'm skipping stones pretty fast. There's culture, the style of the billboards changes over time. And I'll just see if I can get to one or two examples of the, they're very proud of their healthcare system, by the way, so that's something to keep in mind. The Bush Plan, very unpopular. This is about the Barbados crime, Posada Carriles. It's still a hot topic in Cuba. George Bush was accused of being an assassin. And that's, my time's up, so unfortunately you don't get to see the street art in Havana. But it's very, very interesting. Take it from me. Go to visit Cuba if you can. Thank you very much.
When I welcomed you to Dante's Inferno, I was just kidding. But it's turning into a kind of an inferno. We don't have any air conditioning in Maine, but we have a good reason for it. It's a lot cooler. Last summer I had a class, it's actually a media ecology class, and we were in a little room and we had a heat wave, and I was sitting there sweating thinking, I should cancel class. I should cancel class. But I didn't. So we can take a vote to see who wants to cancel class. Anyway, I recommend the fan message. Thank you for opening the door. Genius. So anyway, I'm Paul Grossweiler, and this is not Socrates on New Media Environments. It's St. Augustine's The Teacher, on the media environments. So I'll start with a joke. So what did St. Augustine say to the hot dog vendor?
No mustard.
You want with everything?
Yeah, make it one with everything. That's the cheap part. So what did the hot dog vendor say when Augustine asked for change?
Change is happening anyway.
Change comes from within. And that's basically Augustine's approach to learning, right? So I was working from Pope Francis's idea that the great sages of the past run the risk of going unheard amid the noise and distractions of an information overload, that we need to make an effort to help media become sources of new cultural progress. Wisdom is the fruit of self-examination, dialogue, and generous encounters between persons. So originally I was going to talk about Socrates, which is sort of a rehash for me, and then I felt guilty about that, that I should go out on a limb and try something different. So, but I had looked at Socrates' advice to the youthful favorites in Plato's dialogue by that name about how to cope with the new medium of writing. He has a lot to say about it that we don't, in media ecology, actually go into very much. It's mostly just writing bad and orality good. So anyway, but my goal here, as with Phaedrus, is to search for clues in Augustine that would be useful for today's Phaedruses and Phaedrus. And I really had no idea how I was going to do this when I started out, and I'm not sure that I do. But, so in Augustine's case, though, the young person is not Phaedrus, but Adeodatus, who was Augustine's teenage son. And the dialogue between Augustine and Adeodatus is called Teacher, which is an early work that I think was written after Adeodatus' death at the age of about 18. So I think he was about 16 when this dialogue, so it's in way sort of a memorial, I think. It kind of gives me the chills. So I also looked a little bit at a rhetorician's comparison of the meta-rhetorics of Plato, Augustine, and McLuhan. So there's a trio for you. As well as a Christian professor's article on how good it is to use the teacher as a way of introducing undergraduate students to Augustine. So I thought, okay. And the rhetorician, James Murphy, proposes the importance of a meta-rhetoric, or what he calls first principles of rhetoric, that every rhetorician needs to base his or her activity on. He thinks Plato's the easiest to define in like a sentence. He goes on more of it. Socrates calls for the perfect knowledge of the soul, including its types and its operations, which you can go into a lot of things. He says Augustine is studied mostly for his incorporation of Ciceronian rhetoric and Christianity, and sort of syncretizing pagan philosophy or classical philosophy with Christianity, and served as a bridge to the education of priests in the medieval church. But he found his meta-rhetoric actually in the teacher, centering on the sign. So Augustine believes each person is a learner who has God-given abilities to learn about the universe. He holds that for Augustine, everything is a sign of something else. For example, a rock is a natural sign of the power of God. As a natural sign, it exists outside of any human effort. What we do is we create conventional signs. So you've got the natural signs of nature, conventional signs of us, such as spoken language. So in this environment of signs, Augustine thinks each person weighs words against his or her inner truth, thus telling truth from falsehood and learning from the word's prompts that remind the learner of what he or she already knows. So in ways like Plato's recollection, and in particular, rhetorical device is an evocative trigger, not persuasion caused by the teacher. Murphy sees this hit-or-miss approach in the focus of medieval rhetoricians on bits and pieces of signs rather than types of argument. Our use of conventional signs is of utmost importance because they can either prompt others to find his or her way toward truth, God, or sidetrack him or her into error and disbelief, and ultimately into sin, which is leading away from God or truth and into what I would think of as ignorance. So one of my issues is sort of taking the theological and making it secular, moving away from God into something that I can relate to, not being a religious person. I'm thinking about students, most of them aren't religious. Or to coin a phrase, according to Murphy, God controls the message and the rhetorician chooses the medium. When the medium fails, Augustine would say it cannot be the fault of the message, but only the weakness of two imperfect human beings groping through a universe of multitudinous signs, so on, toward the signs that will for them reveal that message. So basically you keep trying until the learner learns the message. Murphy then fast forwards to McLuhan, and who begins, he thinks, understanding media with the meta-rhetoric that he will explore the contours of our own extended beings in our technologies, seeking the principle of intelligibility in each of them. So McLuhan's first principle, he thinks, is the intelligibility that we find in media. I could use a pen.
We're your biggest fans.
Do you understand
Look how useful this medium is.
I know, I know my computer doesn't do it. So, but Murphy argues, though, that McLuhan does not say how we know what we know, just that we are immersed in electric technology that he says impinge the whole world on us, leading to enormous rapid changes. And that rhetoric would follow an understanding of how electric media affect our central nervous system. So he sort of sets aside rhetoric. These three writers share one meta-rhetoric, though, Murphy thought, which is the first principle that media images are not realities. All three of them are also looking for an organic unity in the universe and believe that this can be found in little bits of data that stand for other data that stand for other data. For science, science, science. Everywhere science. None of them provide a satisfactory meta-rhetoric, though, Murphy contends, because basically, Augustine basically leaves us to the study of what we now call semiotics, and Plato's meta-rhetoric is impossible, and McLuhan leaves us in a mosaic mesh of the human nervous system and electronic technology. And settles actually on Aristotle's meta-rhetoric without further explanation. The other author offers the teacher as the most suitable introduction to Augustine for undergraduates. He says the book is short, 50 pages, although it's a very long read. It reads a little bit like Lewis Carroll sometimes to me. Anyway, so I'm going to skip that stone. Okay. Well, some of the things that he says, some of the characteristics the students find in the dialogue include learning must be serious and playful, that it has to be systematic, you have to start with easier things and progress to harder things, you have to be persistent and perseverant, through language puzzles, detours, and dead ends, with humility. And he kind of does this in the first half of the dialogue with Aristoteles before he has a 12-page monologue, which is actually the easier part. So some of the conclusions, first, nothing can be shown with signs. We don't know what the signs point to, they show nothing. And if we know, then there is nothing new for the words to show. The three ways we can learn are our senses, our memories, or our minds, he actually says, and our inner light of truth that we consult, the last being Augustine's theory of illumination. So some of the takeaways for undergraduates are that Augustine's theory of teaching is just very foreign to us and most students. Learning is an internal process in which learners have to see things themselves. He likens the illumination theory to Plato's theory of recollection, to Aristotle's agent intellect, and Descartes' light of reason. And he also unites faith and reason. The teacher is short, but much like reading Lewis Carroll, it's very complex, and hard to follow sometimes. I had a quote, but I can't write. On some major points, I found myself disagreeing with the scholars above. Augustine demonstrates to his son that teaching is not possible. We learn from inner illumination that the teacher's words may remind us of according to our abilities, but without our abilities, nothing happens. Augustine says this inner illumination, or as Adeodatus says, his private oracle, which is actually, I think, the idea we're like to end with, the private oracle that we each have. That teacher's words mean nothing unless the learner already knows them, and that takes a lot of pressure off of teaching, if that is true. The media ecology idea that most rang true to me, that I think should begin this paper, is that words are articulated sounds that point to things, right? Looking at, they are signs that signify things that we can know through our senses or minds. Written words, though, this is where it gets media ecology-ish. Written words, though, are not signs of things. Written words are signs that signify, or signs of spoken words that are signs of things. To reach the learning of inner illumination, then the written word signs must go through the spoken word signs to get to the things. And that's what I found really intriguing, actually in a contemporary sense. In the intervening centuries, we have shifted to literacy and typography, and we have dropped this two-step signification and think that written words are signs of things, right? And not of spoken words, which are signs of things. And I believe we think of newer media, such as electronic and digital media, also as signs of things. I think of the spoken word, as inferior to the written word. If I stopped writing here, got to the podium and winged it, it would be bad. But I winged it as I wrote, too. But should we skip over the spoken word or articulated word and thinking as a medium pointing to things? Isn't it illuminating within us that a new medium is a sign of an older medium that regresses back eventually to the spoken word that are signs of things? It's true that we no longer read the written word aloud as we did well into 18th, 19th century. But using myself as an example, I know that when I read or write, I always articulate the spoken word, even in silence, but not, each one. Just think of yourself. When I see things such as, I meant to bring an apple, I don't see the written word apple. I hear the spoken word.
I see an apple on your computer.
Okay.
That's a whole nother essay.
Good catch.
In other words, my thought bubbles are spoken, not written. Are we then with every new medium adding a new sign that points backward to a previous medium sign? As McLuhan intimated in arguing that the content of a new medium is an old medium, and such as the novel, the content of the film is a novel and radio theater. I find myself wanting to reframe the medium as a message to the medium is the sign, or the sign of the sign, or the sign of the sign of the sign. I am by no means a semiotician or even a fan of semiotics, but this way of thinking about media seemed to me very helpful. To think of a medium as a sign that a message, to think of a medium as a sign rather than a message, because a medium is a sign that points to another medium in a lineage going back to spoken or thought language and things within which the learner's inner illumination makes sense in an Augustinian way. Because what we can learn through our senses is so limited, what our minds find intelligible ultimately requires us to believe the words signifying the thing. And I was thinking about climate change when I wrote that. But can a digital medium, what can a digital media age, Adeodatus, learn from this? Can any medium as a sign point directly to things without going through the signs of spoken words? Must an action movie, slapstick comedy, or other visual and nonverbal medium be put into articulated words, sounds, before reaching the teacher within, where the learner can regard it against what he or she has known? Whether or not,
It's a sign.
it's a sign. I'm going to get it back here in a minute. Whether it does or not, sorry. I just did this last time. At least, whether it does or not, at least a two-step process of digital media signs through inter-illumination could be a useful tool to break the flow of the confusing proliferation of signs in which the digital media environment immerses us, by reminding us of our inner teacher, that learners are the teachers, the agency of the meaning of things returns to the learner, the connection between the sign and the thing is located in the learner. This step reminds me of what Hadley Cantrill found. Those who panicked at the invasion from Mars broadcast lack a standard of judgment. It also reminds me of McLuhan early on. He said we needed to develop, to withstand the media maelstrom, a critical detachment, as the mariner did in surviving the actual maelstrom, or as Adeodatus put it, a private oracle. Thank you. So we have time for a few questions, I think. We're all going to faint.
Can I just ask Mike for a quick reminder? You mentioned paintings refer to themselves, and I missed the reference, and then you went and mentioned art. So who was?
Heinrich Wolfman, and he wrote this around 1920. It's in his major opus on Baroque and classical. Actually, I can pull up the title somewhere here.
So it really reminds me of Oscar Wilde, The Art of Lying, too. I think Wilde was quite interested in the way artworks only make sense in the context of other artworks.
Yes, that one. But carry on.
Okay, carry on.
Question for Marshall. Cuba achieves everything scientifically. They study all these principles of propaganda. Could you realize that there was a theory behind all these sign-outs and promoting the people to believe in the revolution and to make the United States or George Bush comparing to criminals? So does this have an effect on people, in young people, for example, because there are several generations?
I think it does. I mean, all I can have is anecdotal evidence from traveling around the country and seeing what people think, and it's hard to know what their values are and whether this whole strategy that Fidel really he's a great propagandist, and so is Che Guevara.
Yes.
And they strategized it, and they had a plan, which was teach the people to read so that they can educate themselves to be true revolutionaries. And then they articulated what that model would be. So that's what these billboards have done over a period of time. And what I see is a real firm ethical foundation in the Cuban people that when they think about progressing into the future, they do not believe that they're going to lose that, and they don't want to give that up. So, do I think it works? In my experience of the Cuban people, I think it works. It's a successful strategy.
I couldn't avoid thinking like the cave and the internet is like the light or the truth of light. So they are in the cave, right? They don't want to see the information that is around the world. But young people are trying to, because when you see these great sports men coming to the States and they try to run away from Cuba,
Sure.
it's like a double ethics or something.
Sure, they would like to. I mean, Cuba has been in a state of war since 1959. So the strategy is to starve the Cuban people.
Yeah.
And to deny them success.
Yeah.
And it's been largely successful, except what the people who have that policy, what they don't realize is that that policy also gives the Cuban leadership a reason for failure and why things are failing. But I also want to point out what you're saying about the enlightenment of the internet. Is like, I've only been here listening to people for less than one day, and I've heard many people say that the internet and social media is a very mixed blessing. And I'm starting to see it as a fabulous illustration of McLuhan's idea of the reversal of the overheated medium. There's so much information that's available that people don't know how to deal with it, and they're feeling oppressed by it.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's a good thing they're not getting the internet. You know, maybe it's they're eating good food and dancing and reading and going to the beach. And so it's a value. This is a struggle over beliefs, values.
Yeah, I agree.
So anyway, that's a good question. It's a hard one to answer.
Yeah.
Not just, you'd have to interview a lot of Cubans, a lot of difference of opinion there.
My question is, well, because you referenced Benedict Anderson's book, Imagined Communities, which I've always had problems because I've always thought of a nation as something that emerges out of certain material conditions, like roads and currency systems, and people actually speaking a common language and things. And that's, the idea of culture or a nation as a kind of collective imagined, like a dream. There are two things that occur to me. One, it could be just as much a collective nightmare, and the other thing is that in some ways it's something that happens in spite of what people are conscious of. Two images I would think of. One would be a 1955 Chevy Bollard in perfect condition, driving down the streets of Santiago. That to me, in material manifestation, and probably not even fully with the owner, let alone the government's conscious knowledge, is a unique manifestation and expression of human nature. To me, the other thing, which as a former Marxist, I can't go without mentioning, the pictures of Che Guevara, who, so far as we know, is someone who was pretty much executed by the regime, who's been turned into a national hero, someone who they basically offered.
Which regime executed Che Guevara?
Sent off to be killed in Bolivia. He was back in prison, pretty much because he disagreed with the tie to the Soviet Union. I didn't want to get terribly political about it, but within Marxist circles,
I bit more about that. I don't think that's the story.
Yeah. Well, okay, but certainly the idea of a government presenting a particular version of events which has more to do with the particular interest of the government than necessarily is the nation the government, is the nation the propaganda ministry. Just who's to do the imagining and based on what?
Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sorry, that was
Who's to do the imagining? Well, the government will try to do the imagining for the people, and that's why there's propaganda. So, that's happening in Canada, it's happening in the United States, it's happening in Cuba.
I guess the question is, do you see forms, physical forms of physical expressions of human nation? A Marxist, one of the ironies of Marxism, Napoleon refers to this, is that the materialist philosophy winds up to be very concerned with ideology and ideological control over reality rather than the opposite, which is supposed to happen. Marxist ideology, the ideology, the culture of Marxist country is supposed to come from the material conditions which have been transformed under socialism, something that, people who were critical of socialism have been very sarcastic about it. Because the workers' control, the factories, the workers' paradise that's to emerge. When we look at the actual results of what happens, I think it raises the question of the ideal versus the reality, the really dialectic, and just how much these imaginings, just how well they do map and reflect the reality of a culture. Anderson says that the First Nations were not England and France, they were Latin American nations where 99.9% of the people were indigenous who didn't know anything about the flag or the country. And the people who did it were slave owners.
So I think we have one more question, and we're a little bit over time. It's not a long one.
I love where you're going with it. That's a long conversation and a complicated one.
Cocktail hours are fun.
Air conditioned lounge.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed all these papers, but I had a quick question for Sheila. I wonder if you've read anything by Peter Sloterdijk. In his Interior World of Capital, he talks a lot about how we modern people have misrepresented the Earth, because the great discovery of the compass was that the Earth is a water planet, right, and not an Earth planet. And I'm curious if you have come across any representations of the oceans, or because I'm interested in this kind of mist where things are sort of disappearing that you're talking about, but even representing things as planet, as terra cognita, as this earth rather
Yeah.
than water, seems to be part of the problem here.
Well, in Ptolemy's sort of thinking, which is what is recouped during the Renaissance, it is, you have sort of the world, it is surrounded by water. So there is definitely
Yeah.
the sense already of sort of engirdled by water. But you're right, I mean, suddenly, we move out there and most of it is water.
It's even more, yeah.
So you said this book was called Interior World of
The
Capital?
interior world of
And the author
capital.
was?
His name is Peter Sloterdijk, and he's this really odd sort of Dutch-German philosopher. He's a geographer, actually, but he wrote a several volume work called Bubbles. It's really odd about sort of how we were born into the sphere of the womb, and we sort of live our world in different kinds of bubbles throughout time. But
Oh, that
he
sounds.
also, this piece is sort of
Just
his
right.
take on globalization, and I think would be really fascinating.
Oh, yeah,
what we're
thank you.
doing. Yeah.
I really appreciate that,
If
thank
I
you.
can add to this, one, if we look in a pre-Cartesian world, most map making, of course, is really almost like a trip narrative. If you look at Matthew Paris's work in the 12th century and such, these things are trip narratives. But for the water worlds, they are a type of map which is really sort of the collective experience of mariners. And this type of map is one which is non-Cartesian. It's very much experiential and sort of a collected experiential. So this was the norm up until probably 15th century, 14th into the 15th century. So it's a very different form of cartology. Which the landmass cartology tends to be linear narratives, whereas the water mass cartographies tend to be basically they are run lines, is what a mariner would call them,
Yeah.
the lines of passage as understood, and it's the passage which constructs the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And so we kind of have the sense that we're still sailing. I mean, most of us got here by sailing through the air, not the water, but we're still thinking in this way that we have this ability to move around through spaces like along these routes that we're creating out of the medium.
Actually, what's really interesting, oh, sorry.
I'll just talk about water. Maybe we should all go get hydrated.
Yeah.
And we're a little over time, the next session started in 10 minutes.
Right.